We started as the brew pub down the corner. So we have 35 years of growth, of expansion. No one knows the brewing scene or the beer scene like our brewers do.
When I think of Kansas City and when I think of craft beer, Boulevard Brewing is still the first place that comes to mind. In this interview, we're going to dive into the history, what this place means to the Kansas City community, and what manufacturers can learn from the innovation and collaboration that takes place in the beer industry. Adam, cheers.
Cheers.
Welcome,
welcome
to the show.
Thanks for being here in our house.
I was going to say, tell us about your house really quickly, because we are in an iconic piece of Boulevard history.
Very iconic, yeah. In fact, this room right here used to be our gift shop, but prior to that, this room was our tasting room. When we first started back in '89, there would have been a handful of taps behind us, maybe one or two, if we were had a good day, a good brewing day. But we opened our doors in this space in 1989. And we've been brewing in this room across from us ever since then, so 35 years. So, yeah, this is where it all started.
Yeah, and you were describing how there used to be lines out the door to get in through here before your expansions.
Yeah, so we have a brand new, it's new to us. I mean, it was opened in 2016, but a new visitor center. But prior to that, this is where if you came to Boulevard to take a tour or have a beer or buy a shirt or a candle, we do that now, which is weird, you would start here. And those doors out there, we would open the door at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, and we would give out about 600 tour tickets every Saturday. We were giving tours to groups of 50 every 15 minutes, just because people were enthusiastic to be in Kansas City and to be at a brewery of our size. We've been around for, at that point, 30 years or so. So we were pretty well established, and it was, a great tourist destination in Kansas City. And then a lot of people who weren't familiar with Boulevard walked away with the knowledge of the history and then having had a little beer in them. And so hopefully we're making fans as they go back home, wherever they're from.
Well, I'm excited that you brought up history, because we're going to delve into that when it comes to Boulevard here in a second. But let's talk about Kansas City,
Sure.
your history as well, because you mentioned 1989 was the founding of Boulevard. But as I understand it, Kansas City had previously been home to more than a dozen breweries that had since been lost. Can you share a bit about the heritage of beer here?
Sure. So, Kansas City was a big stop, especially as people were moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. KC was a big hub. I mean, there was a lot of manufacturing that was done here, but there was also a lot of shipping here. This is using the river and the roads. And so a lot of people settled in Kansas City. The railroad was a big business here. And so in the late 1800s, there were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 breweries here. And then Prohibition, while Kansas City didn't experience Prohibition in the same way that other cities did, we never really stopped serving beer. Manufacturing shut down almost completely, especially for beer. And then when Prohibition was repealed, only about maybe a dozen of those original 300 breweries were able to open up. And they survived post-Prohibition until about the 1960s. And that was when modern day marketing came into play. So bigger breweries nationwide were using television and radio to advertise their products, and these little breweries couldn't compete anymore. So I think it was in the late 60s when our last big brewery, which would have been the Mulebach Brewing Company, shuttered its doors. And then we saw a real vacuum from the late 60s to about the early 80s when brewing really kind of came back on the scene a little bit. We had a couple of brew pubs in KC. They were really small, no distribution. But that's when our story kind of took off. Our founder had an opportunity to travel to Europe. And while he was there, he had just graduated college from KU. And while he was in Europe, he discovered a wide world of beer. I mean, he was given a beer menu, and he had never seen a beer menu before. And so he, for about 3 weeks in Paris, France, he went back to that Belgian beer bar every day, tried to drink as much beer as he could while he was there. And then when he came back to the States, he couldn't find any of those beers that he had had. And so he fell into a beer depression. But homebrewing was starting to become a big thing. It was a big hobby. So he said, if I can't buy this beer, I'm going to see if I can make it. And he became a home brewer. Really gained a lot of notoriety here in Kansas City because we're located on Southwest Boulevard, that street right here. So he was known as this weird dude on Southwest Boulevard that would give away free beer on Sunday. So he gained a lot of friends that way. People would come when he was home brewing, and he would give them as much beer as they could carry out. And eventually they encouraged him to take his hobby and make it a career. And then he went to Chicago, attended the Siebel Institute, which is America's oldest brewing academy, and came back to KC with the know-how, but they needed the ways and means. And there was no brewing equipment that was being manufactured in the 80s, so he had to go back to Europe, found a defunct brew house that was part of an old brewery that had gone out of business, Our brew house that we still use was built in 1930, but he had it shipped over, put it together with his brother who was a plumber, and that was what you needed to start making beer in '89, and we were kind of off to the races.
Yeah, and John McDonald was his name, correct?
John McDonald, yep.
Yeah, so he, and you mentioned it came out of his love of Belgian beer. And I appreciate everything he did to resolve beer depression for anyone else that might have been traveling abroad at the time.
Yeah, we're all very grateful.
Yeah, but let's go in. How has it evolved since then, right? Started as a Belgian influenced beer, but can you share where it's gone since then?
Sure.
Because it's a lot more than that now.
And actually, John was really fascinated with the English style of brewing, so that was his style. So Pale Ale, this beer, was the beer that John made back in '89. And Pale Ale, he did an American wheat beer, which really helped propel the brewery. Unfiltered wheat is still our #1 best-selling beer that we make. He had a few seasonals that he made that were very English-inspired. So in 1999, John hired a brewer from Belgium. And Stephen Powles, he moved here from Belgium, and he brought with him a lot of like Belgian know-how when it comes to brewing. And so his first beer was a beer called Zone, which is a Belgian wit beer. And that beer to this day is probably our most highly awarded beer. And then that was when we really kind of became known as we started introducing more Belgian styles. Certainly when Tank 7 was released in 2007, that kind of changed the game for us. And so for a very long time, we were known as this Midwest esoteric a brewery that had a pretty wide library of beers, and we were kind of brewing a little bit of everything, but our Belgian beers are what really put us on the map. And then as we expanded and we grew and we built a new brew house, we were able to really start innovating. And now, like when we make new beers, we have to listen to a couple different people. We listen to our consumers, what do the consumers want? We listen to our retailers and our distributors, because they're the ones who are actually selling the beer to people. And then we listen to our brewers, because no one knows the brewing scene or the beer scene like our brewers do. So we listen to all three of those people, and then that's when we kind of come together and say, like, maybe this is a style of beer or not a beer, like a hard seltzer. That was a big thing for us when we launched our seltzers in 2020, but that was because there was a market demand for it.
Yeah, let's go into innovation a little bit more.
Sure.
Because you mentioned that word, and what I like about the way we're going with this discussion is you're talking about a lot of it is listening to the customers, retailers, the various stakeholders involved. But maybe in a broader sense or a more specific sense, can you define what innovation here at Boulevard means?
Yeah, sure. So innovation is a big part. Like, we always want to you don't want to chase trends, right? Like, you can go out into a retailer or a bar and see what's trending right now. And it would kind of be a mistake to follow trends, because then you're never going to be on the leading edge. So a few years back, we hired a brewer from San Diego. His name is Greg Garrity. Really smart. I mean, he knows, he's a flavor maker, he's a taste maker, but he's also kind of a trendsetter. So we hired him to lead our innovation. So he came with a robust list of recipes of ideas of beers that he has always wanted to make, but didn't have an opportunity in his previous career. And so we looked at that catalog of recipes that he had, and then really look at the market as well, kind of see where consumers are moving to, and then found a nice middle ground between what Greg wants to make and what we think there's a demand for. And Greg has really set the tone for what innovation looks like. So he is looking to see, he's following trends, he's listened to other breweries. We share a lot of techniques with our sister breweries, and then he also travels quite a bit. We were just in Des Moines, and we were there with Toppling Goliath, which is a brewery out of Decorah, Iowa. And when he spent time there, he realized that they were using a manufacturing technique that was relatively new to the industry. And it was very innovative. And he's like, I think we could take something like that and incorporate it in the way that we make beer, become more efficient, and create a better quality product for the consumer.
Yeah, I like how you're weaving that all together, right? The innovation, learning from other groups. Actually, I think a lot of the manufacturing folks listening to this can learn a lot of that as well in terms of collaboration with folks that are in their industry, learning what they're doing and advancing their own processes, manufacturing, etc. So I guess one area I wouldn't mind going deeper is you mentioned you were in Des Moines and you found some new things you could bring back to your process.
Sure.
Can you kind of detail that a little bit more about how you were applying things you saw in their manufacturing environment to yours?
Yeah, so we collaborated with Toppling Goliath, which is a fantastic brewery out of Decorah, Iowa. And a few months ago, their brewers came down here, we brewed a beer, and then a couple weeks later, our brewers went up there and brewed a batch. Those beers came out in the market pretty much side by side. And while our brewers were there, they are known for doing like really big hoppy beers, and they have like a lot of flavor, and they, the really hop forward beers. And one of the parts of the process they saw was an attachment that attaches basically to the fermenter. And it's when you're running the beer and, or when you stop fermentation, everything drops and you have to process everything out of there. We, in our current state, when we're removing the hops from the beer, that hop might be, like on the surface, it might seem gutted, might seem done. It's like kind of trash, right? But what they did was they found a technique on how to extract more hop character out of the residual, the leftover. And it was a piece of equipment that, it was that light bulb moment. You're like, well, that makes 100% sense. Why have we never thought of that? And so our brewers came back and they were like, we need to invest in this same equipment, that the same technique that they're doing, because not only would it extracts more flavor, but it also allows, it's more efficient. We can get more of a product out of like one batch than we would traditionally be able to. So it lowers the cost to make, which is, great, that we can find ways to save money without, reducing the quality, the overall quality. So, and that's what I mean with like, look, listen, and learn, like what are they doing and how you can apply it. So this was just a simple device that was that they were like, oh, this just seems natural to us. Like, why would we not do this? But it was something that didn't really occur to us until we saw it in action. And so now I think that our brewers are really keen on getting a similar device so that they can put it to work.
And this is something, as someone that's seen a lot of different manufacturing verticals over the past decade, I think this is something everyone can learn from the craft beer industry, because I've never seen an industry collaborate like this space. Think about your industry out there, like what is your extracting more from the hops in your space, and apply that to your part of the manufacturing world. Yep. Let's go a similar direction with this. Like, you're a uniquely sized brewery, right? You're larger than the craft brewery tap room down the street, but you're not necessarily what someone would call a macro brewery, right?
Yeah.
Where do you fit in, and where do you want to go? Like, what's the future?
It's hard. We started as the brew pub down the corner. We started small. We started our brew house. Well, in today's standards, is probably big when you look at other breweries that are just starting up. But we started with just one beer, and then we moved to 2 beers, and the volume was very low. And we have 35 years of growth of expansion. When you compare us to like a macro, there's a macro brewery that's on the other side of our state in St. Louis, and oftentimes people in Kansas City will compare us to that size because Kansas City adopted Boulevard really quickly, and we were able to grow in a way that a lot of breweries haven't yet experienced, because they aren't situated in a city that loves Kansas City. The more time you spend in Kansas City, you find that the one thing that Kansas Cityans love more than anything else in the world is Kansas City.
I thought you were going to say that.
And we're really quickly to adopt anything new in Kansas City. If it's a new restaurant, the city will show up. You see it in our sports teams. You see it in entertainment districts. You see it with our politicians. We really love Kansas City. And so we were able to grow. So here in Kansas City, people look at a beer like Unfiltered Wheat, which has been on tap next to those macros their entire lives. They associate us with that size.
Interesting.
And then we have to say, okay, if we had a side bet with the brewery that's on the other side of the state, and we said, okay, it's New Year's Eve, we're at a party, we're going to make a bet. At the stroke of midnight, let's start brewing, both of us, and see who can make the most beer in 1 year. By noon, New Year's Day, that brewery will have produced more beer than we could if we ran 24 hours a day, year round.
Yeah.
So the scope of what they're doing is incredible. But people are enthusiastic for Boulevard. That allowed us to grow. I mean, you can tell these folks in here are enthusiastic. We do a lot of the tours. Yeah.
One thing I like about this interview is there's like live action going on in the background right now. For those listening to the audio version of this, there's literally a brewery tour behind us.
I'm hoping that I can like maybe tell a joke simultaneously as Jake, and so when they clap, it'll sound like they're clapping for us.
That'd be great.
But yeah, we do. I mean, we have visitors to our brewery every day that are excited about it. So where do we want to go? I mean, obviously we want to grow. We want more people to try our beer. We think that like if you try our beer, that you'll like our beer, and that we make a wide variety of beer. We try to make something for everybody, and a lot of times when a brewery does that, if you try to appease 2% of everybody, then you're only doing 2% worth of a product. The quality diminishes when you try to overextend yourself. So for us, it's about creating a beer profile that's really tight, but is still accessible to everyone. I don't think that we'll ever be as big as the macros. Just what they do is bonkers. They've been doing it for hundreds of years, so they have plenty of time to grow. But what we would like to see as a brewery is we would like to see more Boulevard in communities outside of Kansas City. We want people in North Carolina, which is a great beer state, to see Boulevard and be able to hold it up to their own local breweries as, hey, this is a quality beer, even though it's not made here.
When it comes to growth, I've got a question I think the manufacturing audience will appreciate here.
Sure.
What does that mean from a process standpoint, right? We know for a fact this is not John McDonald in his garage with a small brew kettle
Right, yeah.
right? How do you overcome the challenges of growth, modernization from a process standpoint?
Sure. So a good example of that is in the early 2000s, we were doing over 100,000 barrels of beer. A barrel, for anyone listening, is a brewing term. It's a volume unit of measurement. It's 31 gallons. So if you've ever done you ever been to a keg party and done a keg stand before, that is a half barrel. So 2 of those equals 1 brew barrel. So in the early 2000s, we were doing over 100,000 barrels on our original brew house, which kicks out 35 barrels of beer at a time. So if you do anything 100,000 times, but in increments of 35, it'll tell you that brew house is running nonstop, like 24 hours a day. Our brewers couldn't take any time off, they couldn't get creative, and that was just to brew 2 beers, pale ale and unfiltered wheat. So something had to give. So we needed to expand. We had to create a bigger brew house. And we're, in Kansas City here, you've seen outside, we're landlocked. We're surrounded by a 200-year-old church. We're surrounded by major thoroughfare railroad tracks. We can't grow horizontally. Mm-hmm. And there was a real question, do we move outside of the city to the country where we do have room to grow? And most of the people that work here live within a mile radius of the brewery. So no one wanted to commute to work is really what it came down to. So we demolished some old warehouses that were dilapidated and then expanded and installed our more modern brew house, which is 4.5 times the size. So now we're able to brew wort, which is the liquid that becomes beer. We're able to brew enough wort to satisfy demand. Where the bottleneck in manufacturing for beer comes is in fermentation. So the brew house that's over my right shoulder here, we can brew a hell of a lot of beer on that, but that wort's got to go to a tank. And it sits in that tank for anywhere from 3 days to a month. And if your demand is high and you don't have enough fermentation space, that fermentation tank is going to be full of beer and you have to wait for it to be empty to brew again and fill it. So for us, growth in the manufacturing holdup would be the bottleneck in fermentation. So as we continue to grow, we have to look at adding more fermentation space, and that's where the manufacturing comes in, is that we have to have a way to tie in new tanks to our current system if we're going to continue to grow and be able to make beer and satisfy market demand.
And let's talk about quality as well too, because the consistency, the quality, what are the things that you do to make sure that when it goes into that bigger tank, that you're getting a good product out of it, the product that you want and you're expecting? So
we have a pretty robust lab. We have microbiologists on staff. We have Michelle Williams, who has a PhD in microbiology. She is kind of a yeast wizard. She's responsible for maintaining the health, the growth, the research in yeast that we use to make beer. We also, in that lab, we test the beer every step of the way, whether we're brewing wort in the brew house, whether it's fermenting, whether we're moving it through filtration or into a bright tank. About every 6 hours, someone from the lab is pulling something out of that tank or that vessel, mm-hmm. and then running it through a series of tests to make sure that it's free of any microbes, that it's hitting the metrics that we need. So if we say a beer is, like Southwest Boulevard is 4.2% ABV, mm-hmm. that's what we have it registered as. We have to sell it at 4.2. So we have to make sure we're also hitting those metrics. And that's what the lab does. In addition to making sure that it tastes good, right? That's the biggest thing, right? We want it to taste great. And while we have a lot of fancy equipment, we don't have, and no one does, can create something that can recreate the human palate, right? Mm-hmm. And not just the palate, not just my palate or your palate, but the variety of palates that are here today. We all taste things different, we all perceive things different. So one of the things that we do to make sure our beer tastes good is we drink it. And we, twice a day, if you work here at the brewery, we go to what we call our sensory lab. And mm-hmm. that's where you're tasting any beer before it goes out to the market. So we're tasting it, we're smelling it, we're looking at it, we're making sure that it is on brand, that it's true to style, and that it's free of any off flavors. And it is drinking beer at 11:30 a.m. every day, but it is...
How difficult.
Yeah, it's a rough job, for sure. But it's very important, and if the brewery at large doesn't agree that that's true to style, then we don't send it out. We'll end up having to dump it. And while it's sad to dump that much beer, we would much rather not have you have an inferior product. We want you to have the best product that we have. So it's a pretty rigid process.
Yeah, maintaining that brand integrity.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go a slightly different direction, but this is something you've been hinting at. I loved your answer about Kansas City earlier. People from Kansas City love what's from Kansas City. How has Boulevard continued to grow while staying very involved in this region and this community here in KC?
So we're hyper aware that Boulevard would not be what it is today without the support of the Kansas City community. And out of the gates, our founder, John McDonald, he knows it's very important that we're taking care of our community. So it's rare that we would say no if someone asks for a donation for a charity or asks for beer for a private event that's a fundraiser for a nonprofit. It's rare that we would say no. I mean, I can't think of a situation where we wouldn't support our community. We try to support our community in ways by funding lots of nonprofits. We work closely with lots of different animal shelters, something that people are very passionate about. We also are good, we try to be good stewards of the environment. We're a zero landfill facility, so nothing leaves the brewery and goes to a landfill. We recycle everything, we reuse everything, we compost everything that we can, and if it doesn't fit those categories, we send it to another company, and they burn it for energy and reduce it to ash, and it becomes concrete. John realized that Kansas City had no good glass recycling situation, so he took it on himself to create one. So he started what we call Ripple Glass, and that's just where any consumer in Kansas City can take their consumer grade glass and dispose of it responsibly. And then at Ripple, they sort it by color, and then blue and green glass, that gets ground to cullet and becomes fiberglass insulation. All the brown bottles that go in the bin, that gets ground to cullet and they send it back to a bottle manufacturer, it gets put in the fill to become brand new Boulevard beer bottles. Our building has a green roof that keeps us insulated, so we reduce the amount of electricity we need. We have solar panels to offset it. So taking care of the city is like taking care of our house. If we could take care of ourselves, we want that to have a ripple effect in the city. And I think that the community at large sees the efforts that we're doing. We don't have to, but it's something we feel is important, and I think that resonates. So I think just staying closely tied to the community as close as we can, whether it's supporting our sports teams like the Kansas City Current, being a good partner with them, or if it's just if you have a nonprofit in KC and you need a little help or visibility, we're going to help you. So, yeah.
I should mention that I understand that iconic Kansas City rapper Tech-9 may or may not have frequented your tap room at some point before.
I was just talking about him today.
Really?
Yeah, funny. So several years ago, he has a song called Caribou Lou, and I don't know if it was Strange Music or if it was Boulevard. That part of the story has been lost to the ethos, right? But we wanted to recreate Caribou Lou in a beer. So we worked very closely with Tech-9 and his production company, and we produced a beer called Boulou, and it was co-branded with him, and then he helped promote it, and we worked very closely with him. He performed at Boulevardia, which is our big beer and music festival, that year to kind of help promote it. And it was a few fun days when he was on site, and we were filming promos for it. It was a lot of fun. And again, stuff like that keeps us connected to the community as well. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to spoil anything for the audience out there, but this is one of 2 Tech-9 stories you're going to hear in this series. So, be ready for another one coming up. Yeah. Well, not to throw us off track here, but can you tell us a bit about Kansas City as a craft brewing community, right? We're talking about what you were learning up in Des Moines as well. Describe it in your own words, how you collaborate, etc.
Yeah, so, John was the first one in Kansas City in a very long time to really start making a beer for people looking for what we now call craft beer. And over the years, he had plenty of people working for him, brewing the beer, learning the techniques, learning the know-how. But then those guys were very passionate about beer as well. So a lot of them went off to start their own smaller breweries in the city. You're hard pressed to go to a lot of breweries in Kansas City. I think we've got 65, 70 breweries in the region now, and they in some way have touched Boulevard. I wouldn't say we're responsible for the craft renaissance that we're seeing in Kansas City, but we certainly helped supply people who knew what they were doing in order to make good beer. It's a real close-knit community. In fact, we just had 25 of them in our brew house a couple weeks ago making a single beer, with everybody kind of had their hands on it. There's a lot of techniques that are shared. A lot of times when a smaller brewery first starts, they don't have the know-how to test their beer for alcohol or IBUs or ABC, and we have a world-class lab, so they'll send their beer to us, and then we will do that testing for them to help them get their beers registered. We want to, rising tide lifts all ships, right? So we want the Kansas City brewing community to be making the best beer they can. So again, our brewers, their brewers are really tight knit. They share a lot of techniques, resources, as much as we can. You might have a brewery. It's happened recently where a brewery needs to make a beer to meet the demand, but they're shy of like a sack of grain or like a couple pounds of hops, and they will call us and be like, we're in the Hurt Locker right now. Can you help us out? And we're like, absolutely, and we'll just truck it over immediately because we want them to do well as well.
Well, I think this is a really fitting conversation that I'd love to translate into like some specific advice or actions for the audience, because I've gotten to know the Kansas City like manufacturing community, beer, food and beverage, and beyond through like Renson House and the other folks we've talked to in this series. What advice would you give to manufacturers out there, let's say regardless of their industry?
Sure.
How do you collaborate to bring about, let's say, an all ships rise with the tide scenario, growth for everyone in this space?
I think you nailed it when you said community. That's like, I can only really speak for the brewing community, but I know that we wouldn't exist were it not for the fellowship and community that we have. There's a lot to be learned by listening to your friends and neighbors in the industry. If you listen to what they're doing, look at what they're doing, you can find ways to incorporate that into what you're doing, and also sharing techniques of what you might be doing. What you may be so close to it that you don't realize how innovative something that you're doing is, but then when you have someone who is trying to find a solution, and then they ask like, how do you guys do it? And then we provide that answer, there's like a light bulb moment. They're like, why did we never think of that? So I think really for us, at least for the brewing industry, it's all about listening, looking, learning, and tasting. Go and visit, go see as much as you can. Look and learn at what they're doing and try to find ways to apply it to your own processes.
I love that. And as we've been exploring here in Kansas City, right now we're talking about beer. We've also been on the food side of the food and beverage world as well. So my question, this should be a fun one. How much does the culinary scene influence the beer scene in Kansas City? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, KC is built on barbecue. And for a very long time, I think KC was kind of a food desert, and barbecue was like the one thing that people would come to Kansas City and they're looking to want barbecue. Barbecue and beer obviously go hand in hand. Barbecue is really rich and it's savory and it's fatty, and beer is a really good complement because it sometimes can be sweet, or it has the carbonation that helps cut through the fattiness, or it's sweet so it balances the savoriness. So those two are a perfect companion. But then as the beer scene evolved and you start to see brewers getting really creative with the styles of beer, simultaneously you see a lot of really great chefs opening fantastic restaurants and also showing that same sort of innovation in their dishes. These folks right here in this room, this tour, they're going to end this tour with a beer and food pairing.
Nice.
Small bites of food curated with beer. And the idea is to educate the consumer on ways that you can, if you're out like having a great meal, you could pair beer with your dish, and the beer will make the food better and the food will make the beer better if you do it in the right combination. So they're going to do some beer and food education, kind of just to show you and even how you can do it at home. But yeah, I think just seeing how innovative the chefs are in Kansas City inspires our brewers to get creative with maybe ingredients or techniques that they haven't employed before. I think, and I would say nationwide, even worldwide, I think there's a really big connection to beer and food. I mean, you think about like in Belgium, these big, great Belgian saisons, and then the frites, the Belgian fries, or mussels. It's perfect companion. So no matter where you go in the world, you're going to find a culinary dish that is 100% compatible with whatever their regional beer style is. And fortunately, in Kansas City, we're in the Midwest, so we're not associated with either coast. So we kind of have the flexibility, and we could be nimble with our beer styles. We're not tied to like a West Coast style IPA or a New England style IPA. We can have free reign to get innovative and creative and wild with our beers in the same way that our culinary scene in Kansas City does as well. So I think they probably go hand in hand.
What's the wildest you've got? And this feels like a good question to ask
for beers.
To the end, go crazy on us.
The timing is right. So we there's a community partner called Carmona Chamoy, and it's a couple. Chamoy is a Latin American condiment that's made with like fruit and spices, and you reduce it down to a paste. And if you're in like Mexico or Guatemala or Nicaragua, you'll often see fruit that has been coated in chamoy. It's like a thick, syrupy paste. Sometimes it's savory, sometimes it's spicy. But there's a small local business called Carmona Chamoy in KC, and they reached out to us about making a beer with them. We're like, how do we make a beer with chamoy? And so Greg, our innovation brewer, really was thoughtful about it. And one of the things that they sell are gummy peach rings. If you're familiar with peach rings, the peach ring candy.
Yeah, I am.
They sell those coated with chamoy. It's a great on its own. It's a really nice treat because the peach ring is sweet. It's a little bit tart. It's a good complement with the savory, spicy chamoy. It's a really nice treat. So what Greg did was he took those chamoy coated peach rings, 50 pounds of them, and then steeped them in this citric acid tincture for about 4 weeks. And then brewed a wheat beer, added some lactic acid to kind of give it some tartness, and then added the result of steeping those peach rings into that beer. So that beer will be available in about 2 weeks, and it's just an imperial sour ale with chamoy and peach rings. And I have to say, it's pretty stellar. I did not think it was going to work, and I had my opinion was changed as soon as I tried it.
I like the creativity and the expanse of our food conversation so far. The last thing I have to ask you, though, is, and we opened this when we walked in the door and met you, what is your favorite barbecue spot here in Kansas City?
That's a loaded question. See, I don't want to take the heat. Like, all the barbecue spots in Kansas City are going to be watching this, and I'm like,
pick one.
I will say,
a few.
For sure. So, you're hard-pressed to go wrong if you pair a Tank 7 with a Z-Man from Joe's KC. LC's, I think, is a really good spot if you're looking for really authentic, traditional, like Kansas City barbecue.
What would you pair with that? What would you pair with that? We got to get a beer pairing for each of these now. That's the question.
So
okay.
LC's, I would do the brisket, and I would have pale ale. Slaps is great. That's in Kansas City, Kansas. Anything there, I would say Tank 7 or like our Boulevard 89, which is our light lager, is going to pair well with any of that. Slaps is great. Jack Stack, which is a monster in KC. They've been making great barbecue for a while. Every side dish they have on their menu is stellar and fantastic, and I think that you can't go wrong with unfiltered wheat with anything on their menu.
That's the question I should have asked. What Boulevard beers do you pair with Kansas City barbecue?
Right.
Well, I can't think of a more iconic way to end that. The one last thing I'll say is thank you for influencing my craft beer experience, because I mentioned it before, Boulevard Wheat was my first favorite beer. And I wouldn't have explored the craft beer world without it.
That was your gateway into craft?
That was the gateway.
Yeah. That's a story that we hear a lot, and I guarantee you at least 2 or 3 guests on this tour is going to tell the tour guide the same thing, that wheat beer got me into craft beer. And then thank you for continuing to make great beer that can go along with it.
Yeah, I didn't say I was original. I was just saying I was grateful. So, but no, it's iconic. Love what you do here. Still love it to this day. I just want to say, Adam, thanks so much for taking the time.
Cheers. My pleasure.